All right, continuing on with part 2 of episode 6. Who were the angels? Moro Bellino comes to the text in Tobit, part of the Deuterocanon of the Septuagint, the so-called secondary canon of the Septuagint, to the so-called wage-earning angel. He lists a bunch of descriptions and characteristics of the angel to show, again, as he did in previous scenes throughout Genesis, that this angel also is very normal, very fleshly, very human in his activities, with the exception that in chapter 12, verses 1 through 22, he finally reveals his true identity as a Lord's messenger, and he urges Tobias to write down what has happened and then ascends until the onlookers can no longer see him. I shouldn't say that's the only unusual scene. There is the scene where he uses fish gall in the previous chapter 11 verse 7, to cure Tobias's father's illness, removing the white spots or cataracts from his eyes. So he says that it seems that much of Christian theology's conception of angels came from this book. By the way, the book of Tobit is riddled with errors, very obvious ones, and many of them. So it's not exactly an inspired book. But of course, there are similar texts that would appear on the surface, and he points out another one of them here, that appear to be supernatural or out of the ordinary. You see a similar scene in Judges chapter 13, where the angel refuses to eat earthly food that's prepared for him by the parents of Samson. He reveals that they're going to have a child. This is a very common theme with the Elohim, by the way. They always announce to someone that they're going to have a child. Well, not always, but often announce that people who are really wanting children are going to have a child. This happened with Abram and Sarai, Hagar, Samson's parents. You see it goes on into the New Testament too, with the account of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and so on. Also Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. And that has quite a bit of, that has great significance, really, for this whole motif, this whole series. And there's another book, not by Bellino, but written on Bellino's thought by another author, which is very helpful because the author extracts information from different books by Bellino, and I think some of that information is from books that are not quite yet translated into English. As far as I know, there are only 2 books by Bellino that are translated into English, and I've only read one of them. But it does discuss this common theme of a woman gets pregnant right after being visited by an Elohim, and what it suggests is that the Elohim has impregnated the woman. But that's going to get us too far afield here. That's for another video, maybe later in this series. But right now we need to continue on. So in Judges, there's a similar thing that you see in Tobit 12, where the angel ascends. Verse 20 of Judges 13. He says it's much more likely a being who is technologically equipped to ascend. We're not looking at some kind of supernatural levitation. But we will be discussing texts like this in a future chapter in this book. So I don't want to get too too sidetracked here at the moment. So that we now, okay, so he says we now have to make a note that will appear as a manifest to the reader who wants to master this information, and we'll read all quoted texts. The Malachims, again, remember this is Hebrew for messenger or angel. The Malachim's presence often strikes fear and terror. It is rarely appeasing, and many of those who see them believe they will not survive the event. Then we come to another episode, the angel of the Lord, the exterminating angel, or the destroyer in Exodus. It is called, he says, destroyer and exterminator for the very first time in Exodus 12:23. This scene is set in Egypt, and the Jews are about to leave the country and move towards the promised land. This exterminator, destroyer, maschit is the Hebrew word, has mandated to hit and kill all Egyptian firstborns, sparing Jews' homes distinguished by the lamb blood, the Passover lamb. He notes that the text does not allow an understanding of exactly whether this exterminator is sent by Yahweh or is Yahweh himself, but the author of the epistle to the Hebrews included in the New Testament already recalls the episode and describes this figure in Hebrews 11:28 as O Olethruon, the destroyer. The next scene is from the siege of Sennacherib. A second intervention of this Malach is described in the second book of Kings that tells about the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. We are in 701 BCE, and the Assyrian king is waging his campaign to conquest over the territories of Palestine. So it's 2 Kings 19:35, which says, that night the Malach of Yahweh went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. It seems that on this occasion the angel made use of an infestation of mice, as confirmed by the Greek historian Herodotus, and we read in Chronicles 2, this is his Herodotus book called Chronicles 2:141, tells of a very similar event happening in the army of Sennacherib during a siege, and he says, rats gnawed the quivers, bowstrings, and leather shield handles, thus disarming the military force. Many fell. We move on to the plague on Israel. A third intervention of this exterminating angel is narrated in the second book of Samuel, chapter 24, where there is a census. King David is commanded to make a census. He committed an act that was contrary to the Elohim's will, who hits the people with a plague in punishment. The text says that it was the time of the barley harvest, and that 70,000 men died in the territory between Dan and Beersheba. The angel then stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to devastate it, in chapter 24, verse 16. But Yahweh feels pity for the people and orders the angel, or Malach, to stop. So he says, the important fact is that up to this point, we may think that the story is but a figurative representation of God's will, a sort of personification of his will. But verse 16 contains a surprising clarification. This is verse 16, again, of 2 Samuel. Again, he gives the Hebrew and then provides the literal translation. And the messenger of Yahweh was at the yard of Araunah, the Jebusite. Suddenly then, a story that could be read as a symbolic representation becomes concrete and precisely located in a common, unremarkable place devoid of any value. The angel is in a barnyard. We also know that this yard is located on Mount Moriah, overlooking the ancient Jebusite settlement, which would later develop and become the city of Jerusalem, capital of the kingdom of David. He tells a little bit more about this story in 2 Samuel 24. The scourge finally ceases. 1 Chronicles 21 adds a little more narration, adds additional details. It tells us that the Malak stood by the barnyard of Araunah, the Jebusite. David looks up and sees him standing between earth and sky. It says this, quote, between earth and sky, standing. When David goes to Araunah, he was threshing the wheat and sees him and the Malak, Araunah's children, terrified and hide while the farmer approaches David. The last verse of chapter 21 affirms that after these events, David wanted to consult Yahweh in his home on the hill of Gibeon, but did not dare go there because he was still terrified by the sight of the Malak. So he says, to sum up, that we find real, tangible, concrete descriptions, not only within the detailed scene narrative, but also in the contextualization of the event's periods, in the geographical and space location, and also within the description of the psychological aftermaths which persisted through time. Once again, we find that the Malachims and Anunnakis are definitely similar. So we're going to start seeing in the following chapters, this is the position he's going to be staking out and laying out, given how we really ought to, how we should be translating certain Hebrew terms such as kavod, or glory, that he's going to be staking out the position that these texts talking about these angels alighting or flying or having wings or ascending in chariots and things of that nature are colloquialisms, very common descriptions for things that the people could not understand. They are common expressions for technology, the technology of the gods, that they could not comprehend because they didn't have anything in their culture that they could use to compare with what they were witnessing, aside from things like chariots. And we actually see the same thing in India, places like India, where there are texts where they do the very same thing and describe the Vimana, or these flying machines, in terms, in the very same terms, in terms of the Sanskrit word for chariot. Okay, so that ends part 2 of episode 6. Who were the angels? Or I think I titled it, Who Were the Angels, or What Were the Angels? And we're going to discuss kavod, the glory of God, in the next chapter, chapter 5.